comic book that predicted the attack on Pearl Harbor? Let's take a closer look at this comic book, The USA is Ready, a comic book published in 1941 that predates the entry of the Americans into the Second World War. Welcome to Raph's Retro Comics. I love old comic books. Not just superhero comic books, but comic books that also are nonfiction that look at historical events or even reflect the current times of when the comic book was published. Recently, I picked up this comic book, USA is Ready, published by Dell in 1941, and it predates the entry of the Americans entering the Second World War. These type of comic books are not that actually popular with collectors. They generally like superhero stuff or covers that are outrageous or beautiful. So it's an area that's kind of untapped with collectors because, honestly, they're very cheap. They're just not popular with comic book collectors. So, when I come across titles like this, True Aviation Picture Stories, or even something like this, Real Heroes, they're usually pretty cheap. And I'll pick them up, and when I read through them, I find them fascinating. So the USA is Ready comic book is really interesting in that when I look through it, there's a 6-page story that features the Pacific Fleet before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Why don't we take a look inside, and I'll show you myself. So with older comic books, especially something like this old, 1941, it's 80 plus years old, you have to be careful with the pages because sometimes they can be kind of brittle. Actually, the pages on this are not too bad. Okay, so if you take a look at some of these images, some of them are a little outdated even for that time. You can even tell by the helmets that the soldiers are wearing. These are more like English-style helmets, but I thought this is kind of pretty cool. It kind of gives you all the different ranks of the Army soldiers, and as well as a different type of artillery. And I think there's one in here, like look at this, 16-inch monster, did that even exist? I guess it must have, but it's a Canal Guardian. That's just crazy, insane. If we look at this panel, I think it's kind of interesting. It says, though invasion is less likely than an attack from Mars, it sets the imagination aglow to speculate on how our Yankee army would dispose of a foe rash enough to set foot on our soil. Well, let's soon find out. It's a bit different than your traditional comic book in that there's no speech bubbles with people talking. But this is where we have the really interesting story coming up. So again, you have the Navy in a different ranking. That talks about the battleship and the huge aircraft carriers. I thought it's kind of interesting in that they actually specify numbers in terms of how many are in service and how many have been ordered. This is actually what I would consider to be kind of almost classified information. All right, here we go. Battle in the Pacific. At last it has come. Crackling through space to the new Pacific Fleet based at Hawaii comes news that our small Asiatic fleet has been overwhelmed by superior force. The enemy advances in full armored, I don't even know what that word's, panoply against our shores. The admiral of the scouting force gets curt orders to weigh anchor. His tough, compact group of aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, and destroyers must be flung out to contact the enemy, probe swift fighters to steal into his advanced battle line, relaying all pertinent data on position and strength to the main U.S. battle fleet. They will harry the invader with swift smokescreen thrusts and screaming plane attacks until the battle wagons arrive. Pearl Harbor was ill-prepared for a Japanese surprise attack. But it's interesting, when you look at this, a lot of people were already kind of maybe aware that the tension in the Pacific was certainly rising. To give you some more context as to what was happening in the world at this time, the relationship between Japan and the US was at an all-time low. The US had just imposed an oil embargo on Japan and had demanded that Japan cease its aggressive activities in Asia. The rest of this kind of story kind of goes over what the battle would be like if they were to have engaged an enemy fleet. They don't actually mention the Japanese in particular, but I think what's kind of interesting in other chapters, specifically the Air Force one, there are specific mentions against the fighting against the Germans, because at that point, the war, which started in 1939, I believe, the Germans were considered like the main threat. So here you have kind of an air battle scene where you have German airplanes, Americans fighting against the Germans. These kind of stranger-than-fiction little snippets are also really quite interesting. There's a section on the Marines. And interestingly, the Coast Guard. And the back cover has a photo of Admiral Kimmel and General George C. Marshall. So this is another comic book that I wanted to kind of give a quick overview of, and it's Real Heroes #4, published in 1942. And if you look at the cover, there are three major political figures at that time: Winston Churchill, FDR, and Chiang Kai-Shek. And to my disappointment, actually, I was hoping there'd be some kind of biography about FDR, but there wasn't. There was basically only just a portrait image of him on the splash page. But if you look at the number of people that contributed to this particular comic book, it's actually quite astounding. There's like a senior advisory of editors. A lot of effort went into making this comic book. But however, this has a wonderful comic book biography of Winston Churchill. Arguably the most, I believe, in one of Britain's lists of greatest Britons ever, he was #1. So this has a biography of him, and as well, later on, I'll show, there are even snippets of famous speeches that he made. The one, "I have nothing to offer you but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." So, pretty awesome stuff. There's a feature on U.S. Navy Chief, and actually going a little further in, another feature on George C. Marshall, a little feature on military films at that time, like Sergeant York. I'm going to skip ahead. And skipping to this section, to my happiness, there's a feature on Billy Bishop, who was a Canadian air ace in World War I, and one of the few actually aces to survive. They actually pulled him out of service because they felt that if he had passed away during combat, it would be a big blow to morale. But he was credited with 72 airplanes shot down. There's even an airport in Toronto named after him. And the last one I wanted to talk about is Chiang Kai-Shek, who at this point was kind of like the pro-democracy, I suppose, leader of China at that point. But history would not be so kind to him, and he would end up fleeing China and going to what is now Taiwan. But I really didn't know very much about this historical figure, and it was kind of interesting to kind of read about what he did during this time. So very, very interesting. and stuff like the Red Cross. So there you go. The one area of non-fiction comic books that does kind of resonate with collectors are these propaganda-type comic books. One is called Is This Tomorrow? Another is Blood is the Harvest. And these were published in the 1950s, and they were anti-communist propaganda comic books. Another one that's kind of famous is called Teenage Dope Slaves. Man, you look at that cover, I really want to read this. But hey, it's an expensive book. These type of books do have popularity with comic book collectors. Thanks for watching. There are a lot of interesting comic books that were published in the 1940s and 50s. Not just superhero comic books, but comic books that give a slice of time of historical value from that era. If you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out this one over here. Happy hunting, and I'll see you in the next video.